So you should be enabled now.
Yeah, recording now.
Okay.
Awesome.
So yeah, you were just setting up kind of what your approach and intent is, and then I'll do the same after.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, my intent is to really, because I've come across your point of view a lot, and I would say I kind of refer to it as like a Pacific Northwest Canadian view, and I'm very curious as to, I'm sympathetic with it, and so I kind of personally.
Where are you? I am in the Pacific Northwest, so
yeah.
Where are you?
I'm in Los Angeles, and I'm from Miami, so okay. A little bit like southeast. So yeah, so I guess I'm trying to. I kind of feel like I'm a little bit in between Michael and you, whereas I get really frustrated with Michael for putting some like obviously conservative things up there. That's just like.
Oh yeah, Michelle, you're talking about.
Yeah, Michelle. Yeah. I mean, however, yeah, mm-hmm. Michelle or.
Yeah, I assume it's sort of Michelle.
Yeah.
More than Michael.
Yeah. So I can get a little bit frustrated with him with his openness. I think he's a little bit. He's really nice and he's very honest, and I think he doesn't question people's motivations too much. And I think because of that, he gets really misled by bad actors. However, at the same time, I guess I'm in this position where I do see that there's people that I would consider on the left that are making real criticisms of the left, what I would say from the left, that have validity to them, that because their criticisms are then being sort of pushed away as like, oh, this is right-wing attacks. So my whole position is like, hey, look, there's a validity to the Pacific Northwest stance. That's really important. And we need to like be intersectional, and we need to find what's good about intersectionality, right? But I think that there is an element that this other camp is kind of like, hey, look, there's a limit to this approach, and what is the sort of limit there? And I think right now that the limiting group is in growing. It's sort of a reaction to the other more intersectional group. And I'd say that the intersectional group is splitting from sort of this like new Matt Tiabi sort of almost. It's a little bit more. It's sort of like an anti-academic reaction, I would say, in some way. So I'm kind of in between. I'm kind of like, hey, we need to integrate both these things to something a little bit more cohesive, is what I would say.
Cool. Yeah, well, in between is a good place to be. I think just to mention Matt Taibbi quickly, he's like got a strong tradition as a leftist, but he's like drifted rightward recently by just by entertaining Brett Weinstein, like doing the Unity 2020 thing without really thinking about the extant criticism that existed before. And so that surprised a lot of people. Like, what is Taibbi doing? And, because you gotta give some lenience to these public thinkers, right? Because they're trying to work it out from their position. And Taibbi, someone I've followed for a long time, right. but it's tough because I'm all for having the most difficult conversations, right? And my observation of the intellectual dark web kind of arc has been cheating that they've not been having the conversations that they should. There's been a lot of just antagonism between the two sides. Meanwhile, I've seen leftists come out and respond to the very things that the IDW is raising questions about. And so just that's one thing. Another thing is Michelle. I've talked to him before. I get the same impression you do. Mm-hmm. He's mostly aligned, but with the identity stuff, he, is sensitive to the topics as a white man, right? And because of whatever personal experiences he's had, and so is Brett Weinstein. I, as a white man, have not had those exact experiences. And I come at it from the perspective that they're having the wrong reaction to it because there's something deeper to unpack, right? And so I tried to talk to Michelle about that. And in our recording, like he mentioned a few sources, like, for example, Project Veritas, like who, Eric Weinstein also likes to invoke and is fond of, but that does smuggle a lot of right-wing talking points, or it is strictly a right-wing thing. And so they're just not careful enough with the way that discourse is trafficked. So when it comes to, how I came into contact with you, Michelle's post was like, oh, here's yet another thing from the Weinsteins. And I get sensitive to it because that, you know, that issue is so overdone, and I'm not trying to discredit them without giving them the opportunity for engagement, but they don't engage. The Weinsteins, you know, Brett's first guest on his podcast was Andy No. Like, that is so tone deaf because he's like a right-wing sort of fake journalist.
Sure.
Basically just propagates the narrative that there is such a thing as Antifa and that these are really sort of communist people that need to be even, you know, rounded up into vans, like speaking of the Pacific.
Yeah. Sorry, someone's knocking on my door. Sorry, I'm so
okay. Okay, great.
All right, we're back in. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just saying, like, so, you know, their attempts to kind of foster, you know, a post-partisan discourse ends up being very right-wing. Mm-hmm. And there's no like reciprocity, like fair reciprocity in critique. So like what I shared, you know, you said you didn't like the I Don't Speak German podcast.
Yeah.
But when I listened to it, you know, there's definitely stuff like when they're kind of just having too much fun.
Yeah.
I can get how that's not going to impress anybody who's sympathetic to the Weinsteins. But,
sure.
But, you know, I find it so exhausting to keep up with these things because like I've spent years kind of becoming an expert. So when people challenge me, I just want to cut straight to the chase. And like, I want to be sort of candid about my approach. Like I'm trying to, you know, you don't have an agenda and we're kind of mutually truth seeking. Mm-hmm. And I'm therefore a part way, but part of what I want to do is kind of experiment to convert you, like to be sympathetic to my approach. Like
that's fine.
So because so many people, I'll like share, you know, articles like, you know, IDW aside, I've written like 3.5 articles on Jordan Peterson. Like he's been addressed in numerous of my articles because he's such a central figure to the intellectual dark web, and he's been so divisive. And so people develop strong opinions without really having a firm grasp of the whole breadth of research and commentary that's out there.
Sure. There's a lot. It's really frustrating because it's not like it's his light stuff. So it's not like you can spend 5 minutes on it and then be like, oh, I got it, right? I would say, and that's why I really did listen to 2 hours of the I Don't Speak German podcast, because I really wanted to understand. I really wasn't trying to pick at their sort of jovial nature because they're having fun.
Okay.
That's fine. I don't mind that. What was bothering me was their perspectives were dismissive, in the sense of it was just their approach was not here is a professor at Harvard or here's a professor at Toronto talking about Jordan Peterson. It was here's some eccentric academic, right? Some kooky guy. Say, okay, that's fine, but that's not an argument. That's your opinion of who this person was. And that's okay. But what I was seeing was, I think when he got to the Brett Weinstein stuff, he mentioned the documentary, and he said there's this documentary that a student made that's supportive of Brett Weinstein. And he said he couldn't stomach it and he only watched 5 minutes of it. And
right.
That to me is just like, well, you're missing a major primary source here. This is who was there. How can you say you're coming up with a fair conclusion if you're cherry picking the data? And so,
I would agree with that. Like that's not a responsible approach, and I try not to do that. And I heard Sam Harris on Eric Weinstein's podcast say that exact same thing about Sam Cedar's show, you know, Majority Report. And so Majority Report is a great show, right? And so is the Michael Brooks show. And I've consumed like almost all of their content. It's regular narrative. And, you know, it's not that I agree with everything either, but I find it more trustworthy. Right. And so when a podcast like I Don't Speak German does that same thing, yeah, it's not substantive, and it's a kind of a cop out, right? But and I've never listened to the podcast before those episodes, so I don't know exactly who those guys are. However, the way they set themselves up, kind of the jokes aside, was that they I trusted that their podcast did have a good academic understanding of far-right movements.
I do
right?
too.
So they're viewing it in that context. And so some of the important takeaways are, for example, something I witnessed very closely too, is how Eric Weinstein dismissed that report. I forget what it was called, but the kind of the drew the networks about the pipeline to the right. And Eric just kind of blustered against, just did not give a coherent response, but was kind of critical and even misogynistic, as they say, about the author. And so there's a lot of this dismissiveness going both ways. I get that, right? Yeah. But when it comes to also someone like Michael Brooks, or like my research, like if you looked at my intellectual dark web article from 2 years ago,
I did read the one that you linked. I did read it.
Yeah, it's not perfect. It might be dated too, but I stand by it, especially because the first section is what they get right. Like, what is the history of this movement? And I kind of map it out in a way that somebody like Sam Harris, who's in it, or Dave Rubin, who's in it, and I
sure.
I'm pretty loyal to how the boundaries are drawn, just because this meme had a lot of traction, and it had a lot of salience with a certain roster of people, and I list who those people are in the outset. And so I try to give credit where it's due. I try to show how there's a broader kind of context to all of this, because if we were to crystallize what one of the points that consolidates them is anti-postmodernism, right? They rail against postmodernism, and I'm coming from a unique place as a leftist, saying, well, there's this discourse of metamodernism. Most people haven't even heard of it, let alone, engaged with it in any depth. And so that gives a broader context to that whole anti-postmodern conversation.
Yes.
Which the left has to grapple with too. And so there's my experience, but just also, all the people I follow on Twitter that criticize the Weinsteins on a regular basis, there's no progress in those conversations.
I think you hit the nail on the head. And this is what I was seeing with the Zizek, Jordan Peterson discussion, which I really love. I kind of look at, so just a little bit about my background. Come from an art background, come from the pedigree, literally directly from Derrida. So I'm very familiar with postmodernism, and I would say from an early on in art school in the mid 2000s, I was very critical of postmodernism. So for me, I was kind of critiquing postmodernism from the left.
Yeah, it's been done. I agree.
And so for me, I'm looking, and that's where I was and this is where I actually think there's a real value to people like Jordan Peterson. And this is why I would say the left really needs to consider him, is because what he's saying, and this is why I would say Jordan Peterson's on the left, is he's saying, look, hierarchy is real, it's brutal, right? And this is where I think he gets made fun of it a lot, but I don't understand why. But his lobster example is really important. There's an evolutionary path of hierarchy that goes all the way down to lobsters, right? So this is 100% true. Hierarchy is real and brutal. But his whole strategy for dealing with it splits from the left here and goes, rather than how do we change the world and change this hierarchy, it's how do you personally deal with this reality? And I think there's a validity to that. And honestly, I think people need to hear it, especially when the left is only saying, hey, hierarchy is real, but we're only offering grand solutions to it. Whereas Peterson's saying, hey, look, hierarchy is real, here's a personal solution. And where I think that becomes even more valid is when our universal solutions aren't working on the left. And I think it's we are trying to come up with a system that deals with that hierarchy. but we are failing at it. And Peterson is saying, hey, look, I don't have an ultimate solution. I don't have a grand vision, but here are some strategies for how you can deal with this shit. And so for me, that's interesting. That's a real progression, actually. And I think there's a value to that. I don't think we should just get rid of that. Because that to me is within the leftist tradition. So for me, I guess I'm saying there is, to me, I guess I feel we shouldn't, I kind of feel that what has happened with the IDW now in 2020 is different than what it started at. And I think because our sort of, everything's entangled, right? And because the IDW sort of came up as a reaction against Trumpism, as a sort of reaction against whatever you want to call it, we'll call it intersectional leftism, that there was a moment where I think if on the left we would have fostered them a little bit more, it could have pulled them a little bit more to the left. I agree.
Yeah.
Obviously, they got pushed to the right, and I'm really happy that I think there's obvious actors within that group, like Gabe Rubin and Ben Shapiro, who are absolutely moronic. And I think most people have separated from them. But I do think that, and this is where I'm coming at it is I'm seeing a little bit of the intersectional left saying, hey, Jordan Peterson doesn't like trans. He's anti-trans. Where I'm a genderqueer. I know I look like a straight white guy, but I'm not. But it's a little bit frustrating to me when I'm like, that's not what he's saying. He's talking about really nerdy, like kind of like silly, like philosophical Kantian points on language use, and they're valid. Now, does that mean that it's not like entangled into this very tricky subject? Absolutely, it is. But to simplify that and then try to cancel him without addressing it it's like it doesn't do the left any good, in my opinion, when he has really valuable things to say. And rather than addressing his valuable things, you're trying, I see a lot of people trying to cancel him for things that he's not actually saying. And so from my perspective, I think the audience sees that. And honestly, there's a reaction against that. And so for me, that doesn't actually make the left look stronger. It weakens us and pushes people to the right.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of like, how do we get past this? How do we see eye to eye where it's like, hey, look, intersectionality matters. Jordan Peterson's wrong about a lot of things. He's right about some things, but our reaction to him, I think, has pushed him more into the wrong direction.
Yeah. And, Michael Brooks says that too. And I tried to address that in my first article, in a sense, to kind of like, thread the needle. And
right.
I think the problem is just deeper, right? So it didn't matter how we responded to Peterson. He already had his mind made up. And there's so many people that we can't, unfortunately, the left can't act as more of a unified organization, right? Then a lot of these things wouldn't have happened. But it's a bit of a cop-out to say that we're pushing them further right, because it exonerates them from their own responsibility and culpability. And I get that Peterson, can be very articulate sometimes, and you can kind of interpret it in different directions. But he has said some bonkers stuff too. That quote it, and to quote it and deconstruct it and critique it is not to take it out of context. Like, so every critic is responsible for their own message. And I tried to be ahead of the curve with some of it. And I tried to have conversations that were totally pro Peterson. And they were always the ones closing the door on me. Like, no matter what I did, they were foreclosing any kind of real dialogue. And so
I'm curious.
What's that?
How so?
Well, like Rebel Wisdom, for example, they kind of launched on his coattails, and I had a close connection to them through being in a common network and having many common colleagues. Yeah. And they basically just like Peterson does, they lie about things that are outside their wheelhouse, right? So they lie about Marxism, they lie about me and what my politics are. They foreclose, and this is something the intellectual dark web did as a whole. They try to discredit the Bernie movement and foreclose those conversations. So every talking point that was against Bernie that they had came from somewhere on the right. And it was just so sad to see unfold, because like the Weinsteins in particular would have their fallback position, which was, oh, we supported Bernie in 2016, but they completely abandoned any type of like engagement in that regard in good faith to the Bernie movement. They, from that point on, they just equated Bernie with the radical identitarian left, right? And I think so much is lost in translation going in both directions. But the best thing I could say about the IDW all the time was like, they're blowing their opportunity. Like if these sort of pseudo intellectuals like Peterson, who have some things to contribute, want to sit and talk with Dave Rubin and Ben Shapiro and whoever, but and not criticize each other, not break through each other, then it's a total lost cause, because Ben Shapiro is a bad actor and Dave Rubin's a rube. And so like, we could have predicted this. And I'm sitting back there saying like, this is just so insane. And Rebel Wisdom had such a, and they still do, because they still talk to them, they have such a strategic position in this culture war. Yeah. And they put themselves on the top of it and say, oh, we're the rational sense makers and we're good at conversation. But behind the scenes, they're totally ruthless and canceling people. And it's like fundamentally hypocritical and apolitical or anti-political, because they gravitate towards reactionary narratives without engaging basic subjects like climate change, healthcare. They just think anybody who's a proponent of those things, including Greta Thunberg, who's just a kid, they think deserves to be beat up and shit on. And like, so they're not left, in my view. They're across the line on the right, because they're feeding that machine and they're profiting from it.
I just want to be clear, you're talking specifically about Rebel Wisdom? Or
yeah.
I honestly have stepped away. I don't watch Rebel Wisdom. I just don't know anything about it.
And yeah, so if we're to go back, like, you know, you said like, you know, in the early 2000s, you had critiques of postmodernism. Like, I love that. I love like leftist criticisms of the left, right? Because the IDW, in my view, and I listen to a ton of it, isn't saying anything that wasn't already said before by somebody like Noam Chomsky, in fact. Sure. And then so you have this like this pitting, like Noam Chomsky and Sam Harris. Yeah. You have these confrontations in which Sam Harris, you know, it becomes a divisive moment because he has fans. But if you were to look at it more objectively, like Sam is just being like anti-intellectual. He's being a baby. He's being like performative and like, you know, and these confrontations don't need to happen, you know. Sure. And so I came through that, you know, new atheist tradition and kind of lost hope with it because it was going in different, you know, sort of men's rights directions and stuff like that. Yeah. And so it's like, I ended up where I ended up for very legitimate reasons that dovetails with those narratives. And that's why I think like that the position of my critique and leftists who are just also kind of part of that. Yeah. And they're, you know, I love to defer to people who are much more historically aware than I am, because actually knowing the history, like whether it's recent history of what happened or like the long-term trends of these things, that's real. That is so real.
Yeah, and, touching on that, because talking about the new atheists, I think is important, because really I really got into Harris through the Four Horsemen and like, you know, watching Hitchens and watching, you know, all of those guys and Daniel Dennett, and like really coming at it from the consciousness conversation is really how I got it. And so I have found it, and so I've been following Harris for a long time. I used to listen to his podcast a lot. I haven't done that probably in like 5 years. I honestly don't know what he's up to. And so I know, I think that there's something there about how there was a split that happened, right? Whereas I think for a long time, Harris was considered to the left. You know, obviously he was going on things like politically incorrect. And, you know, even Mayer, you know, it's sort of in this weird position. And I think right now, and this is something that I'm dealing with, it seems like the intersectional left is on one ideological pole, and then there's actually what I would call the scientific left, and that it's very based in evolutionary science, and that there is, and I would say that these are the two core mythologies that we're dealing with, right? We have science and intersectionality, and they don't totally agree. And I think on the left, we're really trying to come up, and this is what the IDW, these are fucked up conversations. This is why the IDW lost this is what they don't get. They'll say things like, well, if you believe in IQ, you should understand about IQ. And if you look at the reality of IQ, you could look at the comparison of racial groups. And it's like, okay, guys, you're looking at, that might be true. Like, those might be facts. Like, everything you're saying might be facts. That doesn't mean it's not a construct.
Yeah.
What's really frustrating is that they don't get it. It's like they're empiricists. They're like, they don't understand that not all things are natural and some things are created. And so there's this really big disconnect. But at the same time, the reality of that is damning, in the sense of, if there is a reality of, if you test certain ethnic groups, there's differences in IQ scores, that says things about us and our culture. And so we should change, right? So there's like two data sets that I think we're not fully, it's like, in a weird way, I'm going to take a roundabout here, but classic Greek rhetoric and how do you form arguments is based on ethos, pathos, and logos, right? And ethos is like lived experience. It's who you are. Like, you can't really argue it because it's not based in logic. It's based on experience. Like, yeah, this happened to me. This really happened. So that's what is real. That's reality. And then logic is like, and pathos is like your passion, how you speak. In my opinion, that's like how you command whatever the medium that you're using. And then logos is like logic. And so for me, I'm seeing there is, I think the identitarian and the intersectional left is rooted in ethos, which is great. And ethos is a way better argument style. Like, ethos is stronger than logos. It's way stronger. Like, logos is the most difficult to perform. And logos is the only argument style that I think, once you see logos, you can still disagree with it. You're like, I understand the logic of what you're doing, but I disagree with it on ethos. And that's what I think is really happening. And what we really do need to come together and be like, hey, look, yes, identitarians and intersectionality is critically important and is coming up with really good advancements, and we need to listen to it. However, that doesn't mean that there's not like a scientific way of looking at the world, and that necessary hierarchies are real, and that there's not real value in some of these hierarchies, right? And the whole point of the leftist movement was not to get rid of all hierarchies, but to get rid of all unnecessary hierarchies.
Yeah.
And so for me, I feel like there is, like, how do we get to a place of synthesis between the sort of the identitarian camp and the intersectional camp and the scientific camp, because they're not seeing each other as value, and there's massive on both sides.
Yeah, and I'm totally interested in synthesis. Like I've been working on these like meta perspectives for a long time, and when the IDW emerged, I felt I was ready for it, but I was like excluded from the conversations, right? And so like Peterson is case in point, because like so many like leftists like reached out to him and tried to talk, and like he has a team of people, managing his different affairs, and they would eventually just like decline or ignore the requests, so there, the few instances where Peterson crossed over, it was like talking to Russell Brand, for example, and and there's some fruitful stuff there, but there's also a lot of nonsense coming from Peterson. And same thing with the Zizek thing. It's not that there's no value in their encounter, but Peterson exposed himself as someone who like decisively had not done the readings.
I have a very different take on that, but I would love to hear it.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just a fact. He admitted that like out of Marx's like 20 odd books, Peterson is only read the Communist Manifesto.
Sure.
And that also means he's not engaged with any of the downstream literature of Marxism over the years, right?
I disagree. Can I make a point here? And this
Yeah.
is a point that
I mean, he knows something, but it's not clear what he's really grappled with.
So I see this happening all the time on the left. Peterson or the IDW will say something like these, what does he call them? Neo-Marxists, I think.
Postmodern neo-Marxists.
Yeah, postmodern neo-Marxists. Who he's talking about are the post-structuralists. He's talking about Foucault. He's talking about Derrida. He's talking about this, specifically the one point that he hits on and what he's right about is the switching from the removal of getting rid of getting all necessary hierarchy, unnecessary hierarchy, and switching that to getting rid of all hierarchy. And so there is this sleight of hand that Foucault and Derrida did, where they're kind of just like, actually everything is power structure. It's all power relations. And then that gets you to this perspective. And I've literally had this in a party, right? Where people are saying things like, music theory is Western imperialization on top of. It's just like, sure, I understand the point. Like, Western music theory has biases in it. That's true. But as a musician, as someone who plays music, right? Anyone that I know, like, you can still describe Eastern music and crazy scales within the Western music theory tradition. Like, you can do it. And so what I've seen personally is that anyone who wants to be good at music really needs to study music theory, or what they end up doing is just discovering very small sections of what's possible. Like, usually people who aren't trained in music, they'll be like, oh, this sounds good to me, so I write all of my songs in like B flat. They just find something that works, and they don't even realize that they're in this like limited zone, right? So someone's trying to explain to me how music theory is like this Western imperialization, how it limits expression. And I'm just like, you're not a musician. You don't understand that, like, what this is. Like, it's not this imperialistic thing. This actually has real tangible form to it. This is a good hierarchy. When you do this, you get better at music. It's just how it is. You can express more. And so for me, I think that there is, what Peterson's talking about is when you start looking at everything as power relations, you flatten things out, actually. Yeah. It's a simple point. It's not that deep, honestly. But that's
I think you probably have a better version of that critique than Peterson does, and I think I do too. I mean, it's not something I've like deeply written about because I studied it in university. You know, I went through it and I became attracted to what's called metamodernism as kind of a higher discourse that brings together a lot of different fields and threads and concepts. And so,
can you just go through it real fast? Metamodernism?
It's a work in progress. Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of a lineage to it that is disconnected, right? So there'll be one paper like in 1990, 1992, and then like 1996, and they don't cite each other. And then there's like a handful of others in the early 2000s. So it became this disparate tradition. You know, academia is a kind of open, process, right? It's like these things are never clear cut. And a lot of what it's on the heels of like postmodernism, so there's many trends happening at the same time. And it's all academic. Like, most people don't cite these things. And that's a big issue I have with Peterson. Like, he's never written a paper on Foucault. Like, he's never given a page number. He just says Foucault is one of the most reprehensible people. That's a strong word, reprehensible, and one of the most reprehensible. Like, I could choose to interpret that as slightly homophobic too, because he's just not engaging with Foucault as a scholar or as a person. Sure. He's just going off some stuff that he's read in the back of his mind. And it's clear he's never debated this with anybody or written a paper on it. And so metamodernism has basically two major schools of thought. Vermeulen and Vandenacker, as kind of cultural theorists, developed it in 2010. And it's kind of got its own kind of tradition, and then some European network and Swedish and Danish scholars in particular kind of developed their own discourse around that term that is about kind of psychological and sociological development. And I have my own interpretation, which is based on kind of a syncretic view of all the scholarship. and some important stuff that's been missed. And my intention is to help contextualize the end of postmodernism, which basically kind of fizzled out at the end of the Cold War, right? That's in the 90s is when it started to be critiqued quite prolifically. Dawkins had a critique, the Sokol affair and stuff like that. And then you have all the proliferation of other discourses, mainly a bifurcation into metamodernism and hypermodernism. Mm-hmm. But then there's like digimodernism, transmodernism.
But what would be
so there's a lot of scholarly stuff here.
But what would I guess,
yeah. So I haven't defined it yet. I can try to.
But let's take a step back. So I would say for me, modernism is. And so this is these are big things, and a lot of
huge containers.
So a lot of people have different interpretations on all of them, and so I just want to give you my background and how I think about them. For me, modernism really comes out of art, and it's really coming out of modernism and kitsch, Clement Greenberg, and it's basically saying, hey, what art is doing is not trying to be other things, and so modernism is all about being yourself. It's about being self-defined, right? And so I would say that's the core tenet of modernism, and that's why you see on modern buildings, you see the construction is outside. It's like you see the structure of the building. There's no facade. And so then you get to postmodernism, and for me, postmodernism is saying, hey, look, we don't have to do things one way. We could pick from any different way. We basically have all of history. We're now at the top. We have all of history. We could pick whatever we want, right? There's no rules. We can just grab whatever we want. How would metamodernism sort of fit within that progression, I guess?
Yeah, so Vermeulen and Van den Akker do in part take it through that artistic tradition, right? Because those terms, modernism and postmodernism, have specific meanings and timeframes and cohorts with respect to art. I consider that, like, I take that into account, and I consider also, the birth of modernity is like the sort of the printing press, in the kind of 15th century, right? And so there's a whole discourse around all of that, right? And there's a sense in which, modernity is still with us to today. We're still in a modern context, but also postmodernism emerges over centuries and crystallizes in the 60s and 70s in discourse as well. And so technology has a lot to do with it. But to answer your question about art, I think they touch on a number of new trends, like super hybridity is one of them, which is like, so if postmodernism is like mashup culture, mm-hmm. super hybridity is like even more so kind of juxtaposition of totally absurd elements like terrorists using social media and kind of like propaganda that I mean, it's too vague in my mind, but that's one of the articles in a book. They published a book called Metamodernism in 2017, and it kind of digs into a lot of these different trends. Performatism is one of the things mentioned. Kind of films like Wes Anderson, are kind of interested in that, and kind of surrealist stuff like Charlie Kaufman, who I love.
I love Kaufman. Kaufman's my favorite. He gave me goosebumps. Just
Awesome.
And so, I mean, I don't know if this adds anything, but I just tracking that art sort of trajectory, I kind of came up with, after postmodernism, what the art world went into was really contemporary art. It's like mm-hmm. contemporary art. And so I feel like really in the 90s to like 2015, it was contemporary art. And so what comes after contemporary art? And I love this, it's post-contemporary art. And that makes so much sense to me. It's like, yeah, we're in the post-contemporary. Like, it's moving so fast right now that we're making new symbols without having meaning behind the symbols. So the symbols are happening faster than we can actually provide the meaning.
Yeah.
And it's like terrorists on Facebook. That's like,
yeah, exactly. and to give it a little more concrete basis, like the broad sense of metamodernism is characterized by the 2000s, as a periodization marker. And so things like 9/11 and so like fourth wave terrorism, as they call it, and the global war on terror in response, neoliberalism declining, the financial crisis in 2008, like there's all these markers, and we have like new art, new modes of analysis, the actual literal like chronological shift of the millennium, even though time is socially constructed too, it's just coincidentally that these things are happening at the year 2000, right? The internet.
Sure. Yeah.
And so it's just, it's a very difficult term to discuss because we can go into different subcategories and unpack things all day.
Right. So my question would then be, is metamodernism as a term, and I'm just really trying to grasp it, because I feel like I have an intuitive understanding of how it's being used, but it seems to be more of a description than a prescription, right? It's using descriptive language. Whereas modernism was a little bit more prescriptive, I feel like. It was trying to be, it was like, this is what we're going to be doing. This is how we should live. Whereas metamodernism almost seems like, hey, this is what happened. We've sort of lost all of these. I have this, I'm just using my own jargon, but I have this concept of narrative collapse. Like we had all of these narrative strings that were sort of combining to make this like thread of society. And one by one, they started like unwinding and breaking. And now we're there is no grand narrative. And that seems to be the narrative we're in. It's like the anti-grand narrative.
Part of a feature of metamodernism is the return of grand narratives. That is a part of it. And so postmodernism was the credulity of meta narratives. Absolutely. And so there's all these sorts of inversions, right? But it's not just a reversion to modernity, right? That would be a mistake. And that's why the IDW is largely like modernist in its kind of disposition and its thinking, when there is a kind of higher perspective. Totally. And so within the discourse, there's a lot of syllogisms, right? Where it goes modernism, postmodernism, metamodernism, right? Yes, there's a ton of those. There's probably like 20 or 30 good articulations. One simple one is like postmodernism is about deconstruction and metamodernism is about reconstruction.
I love that. I'm so aligned with that. I'm like right there. I'm like, yes, I'm all about, and this is what I'm really critical about Michel on this. It's like, dude, you have a huge platform. Why are you posting on Facebook? Why are you not making an app? Why are you not making an instant? It like really frustrates me because I feel like what he could be doing, he's not doing. It's just like, we need institutions. And honestly, what I started in the engagement with you is I thought you had a really great point. You were like, Michel, why don't you pitch in my Patreon? I'm doing good work, And it's just like, he needs to be able to position himself to create real institutions of power, because a lot of people are doing this work. I'm not getting paid for this. I'm a producer. That's like my day job is in filmmaking. And so like all of this is just extra energy on the side that you have to put in. And going to the activist groups, like there was one in downtown LA that we were in like police reform groups. 20 people are part of this doing like real hard work, and it's all volunteer time.
Yeah.
So it's like, how do you deal with the fact we really need to recreate institutions? And I think one of the biggest errors of postmodernism was, and it needed to be done, I get it. Like there was a time and place for everything, but like the criticism of the institutional critique went a little bit too far and got rid of too many leftist institutions. And now we're sort of like, we don't have the, my friends who work for a big corporation, they have big corporate backing. They have that big corporate salary. When you're out doing activism by yourself, you're isolated. And I think it's so important for us to come together and like recreate things. It's like, now is the time of really coming up with new meta narratives.
Yeah. And it's also like deconstruction is incredibly useful, but it's like, it has diminishing returns, right? So we need to reconstitute not just society, but like the discourse itself from all these fragments and all these atoms. Really, it's very atomized. And
absolutely.
So
no, that's awesome. I knew like just listening to you, I was just like, we're gonna agree so much more than we disagree.
But I've gotten so much heat and hatred from IDW loyalist types. Like it doesn't matter what I do, You know, they're you know, and Peterson is partly responsible for this when he endorses fundamentally people like Viktor Orban, you know, and you know, they align on the issue of wanting to shut down university departments. You know, that is a fascist thing. That is what fascists do. And it's like that's overcorrecting hugely from, you know, from how we would critique these fields and what they need to do.
So on that point, though, and this is kind of going back to the whole basis of the how we started the conversation, and this is one thing that I would like to express is there a scenario where their criticisms of academia and what's going on with the student-professor relationships are valid, and that while we can, I think F. Scott Fitzgerald has a great quote. I use it all the time. It's the mark of a first-rate thinker who can hold two ideas in their mind and not go and say, yeah, that's something like it. And so, like, we have to hold these two opposing ideas in our heads that power structures and hierarchies really exist and are true, and that's obvious, of course. That some hierarchies are necessary, and that sometimes there are situations where subordinates are acting, they're bad actors that are subordinates. Not all subordinates are good actors, right? And so I guess my question is, and this kind of ties into Evergreen State, but it also goes to like, what is it, Camila Paglia? I think what is it? Or I forget exactly where she's at.
Right.
But she was trying to be taken down, and it's just like, what do you guys, like, at some point, not like, there has to be some sort of like, okay, we're teaching this very powerful critique. What happens when someone's holding up a mirror and that mirror is being held up without sincere intention? Like, and at some point, like, we have to be open to the fact that there can be students who are bad actors, right? And so where is the line there, I guess, for me, in the sense of, can there sort of be an opening of, and this is the real question that I have, is one, that whole scenario is what I would call the vampire's castle. And it's flipping leftist critique back on leftists and leftist leaders, right? Does that exist, and how do we deal with that in the left to move past it? Because I don't think it's
yeah, it's a tricky one. And you know, I keep revisiting this concept, and Michael Brooks is somebody who talked about it a lot, and it's tricky because it just needs to be revisited. I don't think it's a clear-cut thing what the vampire castle is. When I was rereading it, it's like, well, this could apply to a number of situations. I think what Fisher was getting at was particularly leftists being canceled by centrists, but he kept using the term leftists, like cancel, you know. And so this is, you know, where I've like just reached an impasse with so many people, is talking about like left, right, center on the political spectrum. Yeah. Like, sort of Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden are not leftists.
Center right.
They're not, yeah, exactly, center right. So it's like that's a huge power base. And then that means, you know, obviously that conservatives, the Republican Party, are even further right. You know, that's what that means. And so when we talk about the left, it's like, you know, they would make it sound like it's just this like small yet powerful faction of like intersectionalists, as you say. And I think some of those intersectionalists, like the way the word woke is used now, those are the ones that are like pro-Biden and pro-Clinton because they just want to get on with the Democratic.
Yes.
Right.
So,
but
yes.
But then there's the other intersectionalists who are like socialists, like Bernie Sanders, like, and it's not, absolutely. Yeah, and that's a lot of, that's the majority of people, in fact, though, and that's the frustrating thing.
Okay, yeah, you're hitting the nail on the head, and this is what I'm saying is, right, I think true intersectionalism, like the Bernie camp, has a massive validity to it, but then there's the center, like, it's more center-left. It's center, there's like a center-left, center-right, it's like it's an unsaid alliance that is that's using woke politics to push corporate agendas.
Yeah.
And they're saying, hey, we'll give you, it's like they're saying to the really left, they're saying, hey, we're going to give you all these nominal victories as long as we can keep our base sort of operating system. And I think that specifically people see straight through, and it's actually really damaging to the left because what the layperson sees is intersectionality is a Band-Aid on root causes. And that's extremely dangerous.
For sure.
It's really bad for us because it takes away the reality of the fact that lived experience is a fact, and that people have vastly different experiences, and we need to incorporate that into our analysis. And so it's like, to me, it's a really tricky project because, and honestly, I think at the end of the day, and this is where I will be like to people like Michelle and to political leaders is, one, we have to institutionalize. We have to make real leftist institutions, not center-right institutions, but we need to have real power bases and real salaries and like real collaboration with people. And so to me, until we can do that, I think it's almost not worth engaging in this sort of like what Michelle is doing. And I really think Michelle, and I think in general, the P2P group should stop focusing on the intersectionalists and critiquing them. And if they do have a critique for them, don't say it, because the intersectionalists are talking about ethos, right? And they're saying everything sucks right now, and how do you not know what's going on? And what I tend to see, and of course there are some younger ones, but I would say the scientific left, the non-intersectional left, is a little bit older on average. And I think they don't understand the reality on the ground right now. And I really think we need to get those older people that have that capital advantage. And this is what I would say, I think that the Weinsteins are worth keeping around. In the sense, you have someone in Eric Weinstein, he's a capitalist, he's a managing director for Thiel Capital, right?
Yeah.
But he was on Dave Rubin's show, who is a Rubin and an idiot, and you can tell in this clip. I can send you the clip. But he's talking to Rubin and Peterson. I think it was all of it. It was like Rubin, Peterson, and Shapiro was there, and Eric Weinstein. And in my opinion, Eric Weinstein is, especially when he's talking about economic things, is vastly superior to all of them. Like Dave Rubin couldn't even comprehend what they were saying. But Weinstein himself is questioning the system of capital. He's like, really like, I don't know, I think there's something might be wrong with capitalism. And it's like, as a capitalist, he's saying that's massively value to us. It's like, if we could he's almost like you flipping a Sith Lord to a Jedi in a weird way, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, I think like he sees glimmers of it. And I think he's more open to the leftist ideas on the economic elements, which would be massively valuable to us. I do think that he might have some issues with identitarian positions. That is true. But I'm sort of arguing that, can we come up with a broad coalition of the left that gives space for people that have the sort of scientific view or the scientific viewpoint and people that have the identitarian viewpoint? Is that possible? Can we do it? Mm-hmm. And I don't know, like maybe we can.
Yeah. So I want to agree, but like, I know people who know them. Yeah. And there's no like getting the message through, right? And you look at the rosters of their podcasts, right? Of the Portal, which just makes me think about like looking up Eric's butt, and the Dark Horse podcast, right? You look at the lists, and I'm critical of Jim Rutt too, of Game B, and of who his guest list is. It's not just that it's not diverse enough, but there's no engagement with what they're criticizing. And I find the Weinstein so hegemonic. Like, they're just interested in growth and their community. And they're very abrasive towards critics and leftists, right? So it's like, the blame game is going on both ways, but they're still the ones with the kind of influence and shutting the door in leftists' faces, and just saying things off the cuff. Like, I'll give credit where it's due. All these guys are good speakers. They talk a good game. And so it's easy to listen to them for hours because they're very confident in what they're talking about. But, you know, they'll go off about BLM or whatever the topic of the day is. And it just comes across as so tone deaf, insensitive, counterproductive, even if they're getting some nugget of a valid critique, right? It's just so comes from a pretentious place. So, you know, they people often whine about the guilt by association critique, but I would say that there's some legitimacy to that. Like you mentioned, right? That Eric works for Teal Capital. Like, yes. I think that's a mark against him. It's not enough that he says, oh, there's a problem with capitalism.
Oh, it's bad. It's a huge mark against him. I mean, it's not even a mark. It's like, it's picking a side. It's like,
yeah, exactly. Right. And so I really try in good faith to like listen to their content sometimes. And at this point, it's more that I track other people who are criticizing it regularly. And that's why, like I shared, you know, to go back to the, I don't speak German, and you know, there's so many clips out there, and it just doesn't penetrate. It doesn't get across. And I want to see all of these people engage at the kind of critical standard that I'm trying to set.
Yeah. Okay. So on that note, I would say that it's tough. I would have to say, if in a way, it's kind of like they're all claiming the vampire castle exists and it has problems. And then when I listen to the I Don't Speak German podcast, to me, it's just like two people saying, oh, the vampire castle doesn't exist, without realizing the other side is talking about them. It's like the I Don't Speak German podcast is the vampire's castle to the other side. Like, from my perspective, that is the vampire's castle. From the IDW, that is the vampire's castle. So for me, it's a little bit, you're talking about non-engagement. It's like it's beyond non-engagement. It's like a French person is speaking to an Italian person, and they're both speaking their own language, you know. And so, like, or not even French and Italian, it's like French and Korean or whatever, you know, completely different languages. And so I really feel like, and this is really what I like, and it really stems back to this whole notion, I think, of metamodernism and the fall of grand narratives and searching. I think this process is searching for new grand narratives. But I think it really is in this process of trying to find one that we're in this scenario, is that we don't have one. We don't have this sort of like anti-institutional narrative. That's a really easy narrative to grasp on. There's all these powers are bad. We need to get rid of all these institutions. We could all immediately go on it. The moment you're like, hey, we need to create a new institution, well, now you have to do design work. It's not an oppositional thing. It's a creative thing. It's not. And so art. So for me, what art is it's a process of information that goes from noise to signal. And so composition is composing information from chaos to composition. And so that process is combinatorial, but that's really hard work. You know, you're not deconstructing something, you're constructing something, you're combining. And so what exactly that looks like, we don't have yet. And we're sort of stumbling through.
Yeah, but you say that, but like the IDW, as I'm kind of claiming here, like they hand waved away the Bernie movement, right? And so the Bernie platform had things like the Green New Deal, Medicare for All, like these can be critiqued too, but they're baselines. The Bernie movement is trying to establish universal baselines and also a more honest politics, right? Because Bernie's candid, yeah. You know, he's genuine. His track record is like stellar compared to his opponents, but all of that gets lost in the noise, right? And so I can't help but continue to hold the Weinsteins like directly, you know, that they have some responsibility for this and for their opposition in this cycle. And now, right now, they're in the middle of their Unity 2020 thing, and some of the criticism is maybe like, seems like it's doing the same thing as the I Don't Speak German guys. It might seem dismissive, but I think they're doing their homework. I think it's penetrating. the leftist socialists and like sort of apolitical kind of design stuff that I follow is is much more coherent than people give it credit for, you know. So again, like I mentioned, Sam Harris kind of trying to like kind of discredit Chomsky, like that has an effect, right? So now all of those Sam Harris fans like dismiss Chomsky, like that's, you know. And
I didn't know that happened. I'm not a huge Chomsky fan myself, but I didn't know that they had a spat. That's interesting.
Yeah, and you know, not, you know, this phrase is perfect, but climate change is part of the new grand narrative and organizing principle. Like we're in this, you know, the term the Anthropocene is a big marker for metamodernism too, right? And so this actually occurs above politics. And but when you try to put it into effect, again, it's the like Bernie Sanders types that have a serious proposal to doing this and a kind of unity proposition.
So on that, I think Joe Corbett is his name, the guy who...
Yeah, he's blocked me now. I offered to talk to him.
Yeah, I mean, totally called him out on his cowardice. Yeah. But he did make an interesting point. I don't know if you saw it.
I can't see it because I'm blocked, and that speaks to my complaint.
But he was saying that Brett is a supporter of Bernie. And they both of them were up until 2016, and then you can track basically their anti-Bernie statements. Like it's clear, like especially on Twitter, they just make it clear that they're not supportive. So Brett was a Bernie Sanders supporter, and Joe Corbett actually has pretty good class analysis. Like when he would say something along those lines, I would usually agree. But then when it came to the race stuff, I just, you know, the narrative he was trying to perpetuate could be critiqued. It didn't hold up. He was trying to, you know, basically use statistics to support a particular narrative. And if we really engage, if we really clashed and unpack that, there'd be a resolution. Well, going on that, I think that's a really important topic. And I think, so there's sort of two different narratives that I see competing right now. And I think this is worth sort of explicitly just stating. And I see this between two different sides of the left. Is you have the class analysis side that's saying, hey, look, the racism that's going on is resultant because of the class structures, and that class structures are using racism to separate us in order to prevent classes from uniting. That's one camp. And then there's another camp that seems to be like, wow, we are so fucking racist. How can we be so racist and evil? And it's just like really depressing. And I think that that's true. Like, obviously there are racist, evil people, and using race to destroy class stuff is racist and evil. Like, that's not invalid. But I would tend to fall into the class camp that I don't think the core motivations of the systemic reasons why we have the crazy racism are racist in their end goals. They're really capitalist and greedy. And they don't care the fact that they're going to use racism to get to those means, right? And so I would actually, and this isn't to defend the Weinsteins, this is more of a criticism of the Bernie. I'm a huge Bernie supporter. You could look at my donation list.
Great.
In AOC. But it's, I would say there was a bit of a strategic move to the identitarian camp on the Bernie side that I think would have benefited with also a sort of doubling down on like union issues and worker rights. So I don't think, to me, it's not about choosing one or the other. It's about marrying both of them. It's like, it's not enough to be like, it's not enough just to be, hey, look, you know, America's racist. We have racial problems. We have massive issues with race, and we need to have policies that address that. But we should also say America is brutally capitalistic, and we have massive problems that stem from that too. It's like, we have more than one problem. You know, to me, it's like we need to have complex solutions to get to more than one problem that we have. But yeah, I guess I haven't, honestly, I really have taken a step back from the whole IDW movement since beginnings in like 2017, 20.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have, and it has new kind of incarnations now. Yeah.
But yeah, I would. That's interesting. So you're saying they no longer supported him.
Yeah, and the Weinsteins are still very influential, and so I'm sort of collapsing the IDW term just into them now because it's changed so much. But there's still part of my meta critique is that when I think I have the right critique, it just doesn't get through, and that's indicative of the meta problem, right? So there's this game B thing. I was in the group, I was active. There's a lot of reactionaries, a lot of people who I would call racist or who just didn't get the race issue, and they would defend racist people, right? They would say like, there's no racism in America. And I'd be like, well, what about Rush Limbaugh? He just got a Presidential Medal of Freedom from Trump in the middle of fucking like Black History Month, and they dogpiled on me, and I got kicked out of the group because I was defending myself against these guys who attacked me. Yeah, and it's indicative of the group though, because they're a kind of IDW spin-off, but also like proto IDW, and they're very hyper individualist. They're very like quasi-capitalist because they're trying to make a post-capitalist critique as well. Like they're trying to move to post-capitalism as well. Yeah. But they were, by and large, they're anti-Bernie. Jim Rutt was anti-Bernie. Jordan Hall was anti-Bernie. So they're kind of taking the line of the IDW thinking and saying, yeah, that's valid. We're going to go with that. We're going to, support Andrew Yang or whatever. And Andrew Yang is fine, but it's like in the context of Bernie, like let's try to marry it all together and win, right? And now we have Biden. Jim Rutt voted for Biden in the primary. Now we have Biden. He's got a horrible track record. He's super uncharismatic. He's only like mildly entertaining because he makes gaffes every day, just like Trump does. Yeah. But it's like, it's part of this like death cult that we're trapped in. And so whatever the IDW is getting right, as you say, about their critiques, sure, they're totally failing to combine and to love and to, support a basic convergence. And that, and it's tough, because I'm sure both of us have critiques of Bernie too and the movement, but I think of it as the minimum viable path. And we still have to kind of trust his leadership. I would advise people to vote for Biden, but the argument is clear now. Like AOC posted a video just recently today or yesterday, like articulating this point, like vote for Biden, but for the reasons that, we're kind of forced into a false choice. And this is kind of a chance to maintain democracy, as she put it. And so, there's this idea, whatever you want to call it, vote for Biden, but protest him on day one.
Totally. No, I get it. I know. Yeah. It's hard. It's tough. It's really frustrating when you have someone like Bernie who has so much energy around him, and it's just like, and the amount of effort to stop that.
Yeah. Did you see the Vice documentary on that topic? By the way, it's tough because it's behind a paywall. You can watch it like on a free hour and a half trial, but it's on the Vice website. And I mean, it's nothing that I didn't know already, but just the fact that they patched it together into a documentary, it's very powerful. It's very powerful. And it's heartbreaking how much, as you say, how much opposition there was to this movement.
Well, yeah, it's really frustrating. So I really think it's about getting back to the grand narratives. That's been my project, honestly. It has been, I've come up with this, it's a very banking and transactional system for leftist thought. And I'm thinking like, hey, look, if we're leftists and we're critiquing markets and capital, but we're saying we're only going to replace it with governments, we're actually not coming up with new solutions within capital. We're just replacing it with a different system. And so my project has been like, well, how do we get to understanding like what is the benefits of capital? What is capital actually doing? And how do we move past it and transcend it? And so I've come up with this whole thing called valuism, and it's very complex and all of that stuff. But I really think if we can get to a grand vision, and just touching on like critiques with Bernie is great. I love Bernie. Right about so many things. He's not that creative. He's very old school, and his solutions are very based in like, we're just going to tax more, and we're going to get it. We're going to get money and funding that way, and we're just going to make the decisions through politics. Whereas I think as leftists, we have to sort of really critique the market and be like, what is the market doing? How do we, and is there another thing that we can do? And I think unions did that really well. The unions were acting within this system and really providing value to people. And I think moving more towards like a union model, like practical value in people's lives, practical things on a local level is a really sort of positive and extremely difficult thing to do. Mm-hmm. That is really hard. But yeah, I do see it as how do we as the left sort of get back, like what is that narrative? Because I think like re-looking at the whole Bernie phenomenon in the past, 8 years, if you whatever you want to call it, 6 years, his sort of rise and their takedown of him. I think we have to really come up with, like, we have to assess why that happened, why it wasn't big enough, and how do we grow our numbers to actually get past the DNC? Because the DNC, in my opinion, is their number. The GOP is obviously evil. I think they're going to age out, hopefully, eventually. But I really see the DNC as like, they're the ones who are trying to push capital, whereas the GOP is just trying to take as much as they can from capital. I think the GOP honestly understands on the deeper level that capitalism has a limit to it. Whereas I think the DNC really is like, no, this is it. We found the ultimate system. Mm-hmm. This is the peak of humanity in a weird way. But yeah, I do see the DNC as being more carrying the ball of capitalism right now.
Yeah, the whole conversation gets so lost because because they frame it in terms of capitalism versus socialism, right? But it's really more concretely about like privatization and monetization versus the public and the commons. And that's why, like, I press Michel as well to be just more of a loyal socialist, right? That if he's going to be about the commons, that's incompatible with the Democrats and the Republicans, obviously. So yeah, and Michel knows a bit about metamodernism too, and like it's this evolving discourse, right? There's a few clusters, different players. I try to map the scholarship and make it accessible for people, and I have my own angle through abstraction, right? Discussing this process because it's a capital process. It's also a thinking process. And it ties into that the grand narrative that we need to understand human history in those terms, right? And that's also what like Hegel and Marx were trying to do. So there's a sense in which we're kind of in the end times, in one way or another.
I agree with it. It's like it's the end times of Western, like whatever Western. Yeah. Was.
Yeah, and that's exactly why Peterson is trying to save Western civilization, right? And his critics are just trying to say like myself, like as a leftist, it's like, no, I'm not trying to destroy Western civilization, because I get that. I went through that phase. I was very anti-capitalist when I was younger, but I'm trying to save everything. I'm trying to, like, I wrote somewhere in one of my articles, like I think in the one on Michael Brooks's book, like our project is to save civilization, not Western civilization.
Right.
And so the whole idea of ancient Greece has been deconstructed. That's what we need to understand to move on. It's still useful, but like this idea of like polished, like white polished statues, and then that meme actually like feeds into racism. It's real. It's very real. But the fact is, like, people were diverse back then, and there was slavery. It's not perfect, and the statues were like painted, and so we're worshiping this facade of ancient history, and that. So I feel like
I kind of love the idea of some alien, landing on Earth in like, I don't know, maybe 1,000 years after we destroy each other, but there's no more humans left, and they see all these telephone poles, and like,
Yeah.
they just come up with an elaborate religion that the inhabitants of this planet must have had that explains all the light poles and the telephone poles.
Yeah.
It's just like completely incorrect. Yeah, no, I definitely, it's we're stumbling through the dark, and we're coming to some. I think it's difficult, but I do think we are progressing, and I do think we are in a time of synthesis, which is like way more difficult than deconstruction, in my opinion. And so, yeah, I'm really happy we had the conversation, because I think, to me, in my whole goal, and I know, it's not about conversion of like, is the IDW good or bad or all of that. Like, it's problematic. Like, I get it, but everything's problematic. And so for me, it's not so much about pointing out the problems. We need to address the problems. I'm not saying we should ignore them. We have to address the problems. But what are the best solutions to move forward and get out of the scenario? And so, in a way, I kind of think that all the effort that we spend on critiquing things like the IDW is better spent in creating actual institutions. And I know it's a silly thing to say at the end of like a long discussion about this critique, but I really do think it's way more valid. Like, if you're the IDW, don't freaking critique the identitarians. Make better institutions. Like, if you're really worried about cancel culture, which is kind of crazy, make a place that you can invite the people that got canceled. If that's what you're thinking, that is,
yeah,
like, make it.
And that's kind of what they did. They made a safe space for themselves, but it turns out to be mostly white men, right? And so
right. Sure.
that's where it's upside down. It's like they are themselves are an identitarian movement by being an anti-identitarian movement.
Right. Yeah. Then that's important to recognize too. It's like, you can't criticize identitarianism without looking at your own self and your own group. So there's a lot to unpack, but I do think that if we could have more patience as leftists, I think we would ultimately gain more space than less. And I think sometimes there is a rush. And I would have to say, especially in Trump's sort of America, we're in a scenario, and I think we're sort of getting out of this right now, but we've been in a scenario that was so toxic and so inhuman that there was a sense-making apparatus that humans have that's just tribal, in the sense of, like, how can you be against Black Lives Matter? That's absurd. You must be a terrible person. And I do sincerely kind of think that in a weird way. But that's not true. Like, I think that you can have criticisms to Black Lives Matter and still be a fine person and not a racist. Is that going to be difficult? And would that mean that racists wouldn't use your argument to push racist things? Of course that would happen. So now we're in this like double entangled scenario where you don't want to enable real racists with valid criticisms. And so, and this happens across the board. This isn't a race thing. This happens in any sort of scenarios. How do you deal with the fact that there's an other side of bad actors who are willing to take valid criticisms and weaponize it? And that's across the board. And I think it's a really extremely problematic thing that the only way to fight against is patience. It's like a really stupid, slow process, but it's like, how do we get to like a patience where we could be like, what is your intention? I'm not trying to do gotchas, you know, like, because if someone has a really bad intention, they'll say it. They'll get themselves in trouble. So we don't even have to do gotchas, I don't think. And I think if we could get there, I think we would get people more in the middle to be like, oh, this isn't so reactionary. This isn't tribalism. This is sort of meta-tribalism. And honestly, that's what I think is so essential about intersectionality. Intersectionality is meta-tribalism. It transcends it. And we need to get to that point because, like you just pointed out with the IDW, the moment you oppose it, right, that which you resist persists. And so you're we hate identitarians. What did you create in reaction to it? An identitarian movement. And so how do we transcend? It's like, how do we get to, and I think it's through synthesis. It's like, boom, put them together. So anyway.
Yeah.
It's I've had a great talk. I mean, I don't know if you have any closing points, but I feel so like energized from this conversation.
Great. Yeah, I feel good about it too. I like the opportunity just to talk to a random person, because I still don't do it that much. It's something I'm trying to do more, and then it's not just random, right? Like, we're actually trying to build solidarity.
Yeah.
And yeah, guide each other to different viewpoints or people. Yeah.
Perspectives, because it's like I've seen that perspective a lot, and I sympathize with it, and I see it. I've really seen your, like, when you're talking about how, like, you talked about the IDW and it's just been rejected. I've seen that, and it's like I'm seeing people like Michelle not understanding the critiques against it, which is different than understanding the critiques against it and saying there's something good there too. And so that's kind of really where I'm trying to land, is like the critiques against the IDW are totally valid, but the IDW's critiques can also be valid as well. And
yeah.
So that's kind of where I'm trying to be like, dealing it up.
Yeah. Well, let's end on the note that we're both trying to like take the supposed principle of the IDW, which is like being able to critique and be criticized, and we're trying to embody it in a more real and profound way, because I think they fall short of our expectations, right?
Yeah.
So,
intellectual light web.
Yeah, actually, I mean, that term's been thrown around. I mentioned at the end of my article, and Nathan Robinson of Current Affairs has used it, and Alice Dreger has used it, who was like in the initial list, and then she's like, fuck this, I'm out of this. Like, the academia is worth saving, And so that is the discourse that has been suppressed and not foregrounded. It's time to open up, right? And so like I don't like, I agree with you that there's real hierarchies, but I have no like problem with breaking them. And so like, I don't, when it comes to like debating, like, or whatever, I'll talk to you, I'll talk to Jordan Peterson, right? But Peterson won't talk to me because he's like, well, I'm a professor, you got to call me doctor. And it's like he's really like that. Like, he doesn't like to like associate with someone who he thinks is gonna look bad. But I think my principle is that we really have to be willing to be wrong. And I've already, part of my method is autocritique, where I'm like very agnostic about what I don't know, but I do enough kind of meta research that I have like a very kind of buttressed kind of worldview and architecture of thought and politics. And so I appreciate the opportunity to unpack that and have a dialectic with you here.
There's a weird way of analyzing the math of wrongness, whereas the net benefit of you being wrong, or if you just have an audience of 5, right? Mm-hmm. The net benefit of you being wrong actually is better than you being right in a lot of ways, because the 5 others can see it. It's like being right only besides the knowledge itself, there's a capital return on investment of you being right. And so capitalism right now disincentivizes being wrong, which actually is really bad for truth seeking. And so it's like we would actually have a better truth seeking apparatus if we paid people in a weird way.
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
Yeah. Anyway, well, I had a great talk, and it was a pleasure, and we should do it again for sure.
Sounds good. Well, I'll stop recording there.
Awesome. Sounds good, man. Cool. Well, yeah.
I stopped. Are you still recording?
Oh yeah, I am. I'll stop right now.